Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be discussing the very important topic of why people hate vegans and really trying to get to the bottom of it. Now, I don't care about this topic in terms of, woe is me or feeling personally attacked in any way. I really could care less if people hate me or hate that I'm vegan. I care more about the implications for the world at large. Number one, for the animals, but also very importantly for human and planetary health. So how we're going to explore all of that in today's video is by looking at an article called "Why Do People Hate Vegans?" that was published in The Guardian in October of 2019 by a writer named George Reynolds. I remember reading this article at the time it was published and just being so fascinated and enthralled by it and sending it to my family being like, you guys should read this, because I felt like it was really an opportunity to foster a sort of greater understanding between meat eaters and vegans. So even though the article's from 2019 and it's more focused on the UK, it still rings very true to the US experience of veganism. There's a lot of shared history, and it's just very informative in terms of sort of the past and present state of veganism. I also want to say that I found this journalist on Instagram. He is mainly a food writer, and it's clear that he's not vegan, and I think that's a really just kind of an interesting point. I think sometimes, unfortunately, sort of pro-vegan media and sentiment has a bigger impact when it's coming from a non-vegan, because people are more likely to listen to them because they're like, well, I know you're not trying to preach to me. Overall, even though he's not vegan, he gives a pretty well-balanced approach and look at things, and oftentimes is way more sympathetic to the vegan side of things. The first topic the article delves into is the current state of where things stand in terms of sort of vegan acceptance in the UK. He discusses the antics of a man who shall not be named. You guys maybe have heard about this man, but he would go to vegan protests and gatherings in the UK and do very horrific and disturbing, very anti-vegan things. The author then talks about the various anti-vegan PR disasters that have occurred over the last few years in the UK, including a Waitrose employee joking in an email about killing vegans, and a banker telling a customer that all vegans should be punched in the face. He also talks about how people complain that vegans like to victimize themselves, but there is a lot of legitimacy to that victimization. A study that was done in 2015 found that vegans and vegetarians, but especially vegans, experience discrimination and bias on par with other minorities. So unfortunately, I don't have access to the full study, but these are just some highlights from the abstract, and I'm going to be referring to vegans and vegetarians combined as veggies. So omnivores evaluated veggies equivalently or more negatively than several common prejudice target groups. There was a higher anti-veggie bias among those with right-wing ideologies. Vegans were evaluated more negatively than vegetarians, and male veggies were evaluated more negatively than female veggies. Veggies were evaluated more negatively than other nutritional outgroups, i.e. gluten intolerant. Veggies who were motivated by animal rights were evaluated more negatively than those motivated by health concerns. And then as a part of the study, veggies also reported experiencing negativity stemming from their diets. But he points out that despite all this bias, vegan growth has been strong. According to the Vegan Society, based on research done by Ipsos Mori, the number of vegans in Great Britain quadrupled between 2014 and 2019. He goes on to talk about the success of the Greggs sausage roll, which was launched in 2019 as proof of veganism's mainstreaming. Greggs, as I understand it, is sort of the UK version of 7-Eleven. Also, sausage rolls aren't really popular in the US, but they're super popular in the UK. It's basically a sausage wrapped in a puff pastry. It sounds delicious, but yeah, so Greggs came out with one and it was very successful. Piers Morgan hated it because of course he did. Greggs' response to Piers Morgan was also hilarious, but according to the article, it turns out Morgan was mistaken. The vegan sausage roll was such a hit that the company's share value leapt by 13%. The author goes on to point out that what we grow, fatten, and kill is political. So in 2019, Tesco, which is the biggest supermarket chain in the UK, released this commercial promoting one of their new vegan lines of meat. The commercial depicts a dad veganizing one of his specialty meals because his daughter tells him she no longer wants to eat animals. I love this commercial. It's so effective, and it makes no mention at all of meat being bad or cruel. It's really about as middle of the road as you can get. Also, the casserole that the guy was making looks amazing. I found the recipe online, so I'll put it in the description box. So among a ton of other backlash that the commercial got, the National Farmers Union in the UK claimed that it demonized meat. This quote from the article was so good. "The rise of veganism is a question less of personal taste than of generational upheaval, less about meat and fish and dairy than the systems that put them on our tables in such excessive quantities. Ultimately, the vegan wars are not really about veganism at all, but about how individual freedom is coming into conflict with a personal and environmental health crisis." The author then goes on to discuss the history of veganism, and it's very important to recognize the non-white cultures that were really at the forefront of veganism before veganism was what it is today. Cultures such as Rastafarianism, Jainism, and Buddhism have been abstaining from animal cruelty and consumption for centuries, but a modern day sort of understanding of and name for veganism came about in 1944 when a group of British non-dairy eating vegetarians led by Donald Watson got together to discuss a more concise name. Again, it's important to acknowledge that these people didn't invent veganism, but gave it a name and a working definition. There were some other potential names that were discussed, and a few of those were Dairy Ban, Vitan, and Benevore. I really like the name Benevore, personally. That would have gotten my vote. Throughout the 1970s, writers and activists began expanding upon and spreading the ideals of veganism. In 1971, a vegan intentional community called The Farm was founded in Tennessee by counterculture hero Stephen Gaskin. This made me laugh because I'm like, counterculture hero, is that what we would call an edgelord in today's terms? So there were about 300 people that lived there, which to me sounds a little bit culty. But I understand that at that time there was no Instagram or social media or any sort of online community for people to connect, so I understand why they would want to get together in this, in-person community. So a cookbook came out of this experience in 1975 that was called The Farm Vegetarian Cookbook. It was written by Louise Hagler, and it was the first vegan cookbook published in the US. There was a lot of talk of brown rice and making your own tempeh and tofu. The Farm Vegetarian Cookbook fixed a certain vegan aesthetic in the minds of mainstream meat-eating culture for decades to come. Veganism became synonymous with soybeans and brown rice, with aging hippies spooning beige bowlfuls of worthy grains and pulses, not the glamorous, vibrant, youthful practitioners that now radiate positivity from their Instagram feeds. So basically, veganism had a branding issue early on. To be fair, I found an image online of the back cover of the book, and there seems to be a good variety of recipes, not just like beige, brown food. And it's funny because usually people associate animal foods with being like beige and bland looking, so it's funny that that was associated with vegan food at the time. On that note, the author claims that social media's role in transforming veganism's image has been huge, repackaging it as a good-for-you and photogenic double whammy. Some people argue, though, that a big problem with social media is that it ignores veganism's core ideology and rich political history and has erased non-white faces from the narrative. He talks about how veganism then became sort of dirtier, trashier, and more approachable thanks to the vegan street food scene and creators like Bosch, who considered themselves more food remixers than chefs. Vegan street food seems to be more of a thing in the UK, from what I can tell. I know there's a thing called Vegan Nights in London, which is like a weekly vegan street fair. This doesn't really exist in New York or LA, which is too bad. He also points out that buzzwords like plant-based and flexitarian, which was actually added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2014, helped make veganism more sort of casual and approachable, again with the branding. Meanwhile, there were a growing number of scientific articles showing how bad processed meat is for humans and the planet. Then of course we had viral documentaries like Cowspiracy and What the Health, inspiring people to jump on board quickly. All the while, as we know, big meat companies have continued to lobby for legal prohibitions about what can be declared meat. Even so, veganism continued to rise in popularity. The author points to 2015 as being the year that vegan cookbooks, plant milks, and meat started to skyrocket in sales. In a previous article, The Guardian had denoted 2015 as the year that veganism moved out of the realms of counterculture and into the mainstream. The author then poses the question, So let's take a little step back in time. In the 1840s, the transcendentalist philosopher Amos Bronson Alcott, father of the Little Women author Louisa May Alcott, founded a vegan community in Harvard, Massachusetts called Fruitlands. It was intended to be a vegan utopia, but Alcott insisted that everything be planted and tilled by hand, which significantly slowed things down. Even though there were only 13 members in Fruitlands, there ended up not being enough food for everyone, so Fruitlands shut down 7 months after opening. Their hearts were in the right place, but it seems like the approach was all wrong. Unfortunately, during this time, there was already a lot of anti-vegetarian hate going around, and this certainly didn't help. In the 19th century, vegetarians and vegans were called Grahamites, named after an outspoken vegetarian minister named Sylvester Graham. They were publicly ridiculed on a regular basis in popular newspapers and medical journals, described as cadaverous, feeble, half-crazed, sour-visaged, and food cranks. I mean, if that doesn't just make you smile, I don't know what does. I mean, anyone who says vegans can't laugh at themselves has never been called sour-visaged. The author points out that all of these years later, the terminology has changed, but the sentiment has not. The 2015 study that I mentioned earlier found that among those surveyed, only drug addicts were viewed more negatively than vegans. The study concluded that unlike other forms of bias, e.g. racism and sexism, negativity toward vegetarians and vegans is not widely considered a societal problem. Rather, it is commonplace and largely accepted. And like I said before, the respondents to the study viewed vegans more negatively if their motivation was social justice. The author notes that people also balk at veganism's health deficiencies, such as concern over B12, which the author describes as a rational concern, which I obviously disagree with. He also points out extreme versions of vegan diets like fruitarianism, giving veganism a bad rep, which totally agree with that. And there's also been a growing concern in the public over the pushing of processed alternatives under the guise of a healthier lifestyle. The author wonders if all we're doing is, quote, replacing one industrialized system with another. And although he concedes the negative effects of animal agriculture on the planet, he also points out that the industrialized farming of soy, corn, and grains also comes at a significant carbon cost, which, yes, but no. The farming of soy, corn, and grain is mostly done to feed our animal agriculture system, and furthermore, the environmental impact of farming these crops is nowhere close to the environmental impact of animal agriculture. He also points out the environmental cost of, quote, flying in the ingredients to keep berries and nut butters on acai bowls and avocado toast. People fucking love using acai bowls and other of these kinds of exotic specialty meals as arguments against veganism, as if these meals were our bread and butter and necessary to our survival. I personally can't remember the last time I ate an acai bowl. I'm not saying vegans don't eat them, but similar to avocado toast, these are just trendy foods in general. Like if you look at Instagram, avocado toast is just sort of the like mainstream trendy influencer staple. It's not exclusive to veganism in any way, shape, or form, although it happens to be vegan. And I totally get the underlying point about the environmental impact of food miles, but let's stop pretending this is a problem exclusive to veganism. Vegans cut out so many environmental issues by cutting out animal products, so these arguments to me feel very cherry picking and grasping at straws. The author points out that veganism is rooted in social justice, but that has been lost as it's gone mainstream. He claims veganism has remained confrontational in that it casts people's dietary choices in a harsh relief, which naturally causes people to be defensive. In some countries, meat is prohibitively expensive and people are vegetarian by necessity, whereas in the affluent West, not eating meat is an active choice. The author says, this makes it a rejection of a lifestyle and a rebuke to the majority's values, especially in a country such as the UK, still struggling to escape the long shadow of rationing. We are conditioned to like animals and decry animal cruelty, and yet we are also brought up in a culture that revels in the bacon sandwich, the Sunday roast, fish and chips. One simple explanation for why people don't like vegans is because they show how confused humankind is about food choices and how illogical its decision-making can be. And that, I think, was extremely well put. The author goes on to state that at the heart of what it's really about, vegan name-calling is just a smokescreen for fear. He says, vegans are unsettling and uncanny. They live among us, speak like us, behave like us, but for one significant exception. Meat may be murder, but to some people, the prospect of life without it is even worse. The author then goes on to state that there's no justification for how much meat we eat in Western society. He says the resources that go into raising and slaughtering an animal, quote, humanely, should make it, quote, a borderline unattainable luxury, which in the past it was. Eating meat used to be a status symbol indicating that you were wealthy enough. A chicken in every pot was a political campaigning phrase from Henry IV's reign in the 16th century up through Herbert Hoover's 1928 presidential campaign. As much as meat was an unattainable luxury, technological advances of modern agriculture allowed farmers to grow bigger animals faster, kill them quicker, process, transport, and store flesh faster, all of which translated to lower grocery store prices. Beef madness was something that was associated with World War II. Once peace was declared, a celebratory steak was the common way to celebrate the brave new world. It's kind of sickening to me that in the shadow of the carnage of war, the way we celebrated was by partaking in carnage of another kind. In the course of just over a century, meat went from unattainable luxury to dietary cornerstone. These days, we feel entitled to meat every day. In February 2019, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez was on the Desus and Mero show discussing the Green New Deal.
It's not to say you get rid of agriculture. It's not to say we're gonna force everybody to go vegan or anything crazy like that. But it's to say, listen, we gotta address factory farming. Maybe we shouldn't be eating a hamburger for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Like, let's keep it real.
Slow down.
Yeah, I mean, hey.
So what she said was kind of a common sense comment, in my opinion. She was referring to the environmental impact of meat. Nevertheless, this comment became sensationalized by Republican politicians and pundits. Former Representative Rob Bishop of Utah claimed that under the Green New Deal, eating burgers would be outlawed. Former White House advisor Sebastian Gorka even said in a speech, quote, "They want to take away your hamburgers. This is what Stalin dreamed about but never achieved." The author states that "they're taking our meat" is as evocative a rallying cry as "they're taking our jobs" or "they're taking our guns." It conveys the same sense of individual freedoms being menaced by external forces, a birthright under attack. Ted Cruz also wrongly stated that if Beto O'Rourke were elected to state senate, he would outlaw Texas barbecue. Like the personal firearm, animal flesh has become an emblem of resistance against the encroachments of progressivism, something to be prized from your cold, dead hand. He also says that in the internet age, consumption of meat is very clearly aligned with conservative alpha masculinity. Alt-right internet culture has fostered terms like soy boy, cuck, and beta as a way of mocking the social justice inclined. This apparently aligns with a finding of the 2015 study in which respondents from right-wing backgrounds who prize traditional gender roles were particularly alarmed and derisive of men preferring tofu to turkey. So apparently in the UK there's a term called gammon, not sure if I'm saying it right.
Gammon.
Saying it right, which came about in the early 2010s and refers to, quote, the puce skin tone of enraged middle-aged Englanders. If that doesn't paint a picture, I don't know what does. Gammon technically means ham that has been cured or smoked like bacon. The author highlighted that, at least in the UK, there's a derogatory term for meat eaters, something that we don't really have in the US, at least nothing that's quite caught on in the same way. He says that food is part and parcel with personal identity and therefore politics. The word diet is Greek for way of life, and regime is Latin for rule. So the term diet regime therefore implies there is a correct way to live one's life. The author also mentions orthorexia, which I've discussed on the channel before, and how it is rooted in the corrupted idea of correct eating. He claims it's, quote, impossible to talk about diets without talking about implied inadequacies of those who don't follow them. He references the Briat-Savarin quote, "Tell someone what to eat and you tell them who to be." The author goes on to claim that the vegan conversation is really a stand-in for much bigger things. After all, we're not just talking about veganism, but also environmental and social change, and also contemplating the erasure of tradition. We're bringing to the surface the issue of food choices and how they affect us and the world around us. After all, the goal of veganism ultimately is a world where we consume zero animal products. And he says, no wonder things have got so heated. He also claims that food can be a powerful conduit for our anxieties. In 1968, the New England Journal of Medicine published a letter describing a condition involving heart palpitations, sweating, and headache associated with the consumption of the flavor enhancer monosodium glutamate, or MSG. The article was titled Chinese Restaurant Syndrome, and the true story behind this article is so mind-blowing and wild that I've decided it needs to be its own separate video. But the bottom line is that MSG fear spread like wildfire. It was demonized. It was even banned in some US cities. And the term Chinese restaurant syndrome was added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary in 1993 and is still in the dictionary today. There is a little like asterisk, but really, you still have it in there. You know, aside from the fact that MSG is in many commonly sold items on US store shelves, the anti-MSG craze was accompanied by discrimination against Asian cuisine and still persists even though it has been debunked by multiple sources. The author points to this whole MSG craze as an example of the persistence of food-related urban legends. The article goes on to state, it's clear what's at stake here is not steak, but identity. Meat is still the predominant food staple across the world. Apparently forecasters predict that meat consumption will continue to increase in the next 10 years. The author says, as a ready source of protein, meat remains the great aspiration, the surest proof of prosperity. What's so funny about this to me is that one of the biggest criticisms of veganism is that the food is very unattainable because it's too expensive and it's inaccessible. So if meat became the status symbol that it is today because it was hard to acquire and prohibitively expensive, then wouldn't you think that at some point it would get subverted and that plant foods would then become the inaccessible thing? This was such a good point. He references the writing of Carol J. Adams, who is a feminist and animal rights advocate, that the words we use shield us from the moral reality of what we're eating. Pigs and cows become pork and beef, while vegetables are always called their normal name no matter what form it takes. He says, our language ennobles meat at the expense of vegetables. Strong, muscular types are beefy. Lazy people are couch potatoes. Unresponsive ones, vegetables. Turning our back on meat eating is not as simple as changing from pork to corn. It requires us to reject some entrenched values. He then goes on to highlight the progress of the vegan movement, noting many university dining halls becoming increasingly vegan and vegetarian, the success of the Greg sausage roll, much to Piers's dismay, and major supermarket chains like Tesco announcing huge increases to their plant-based offerings. But still, the animal protein market is $1.7 trillion, and at least as of 2019, plant-based alternatives were barely making a dent. He says that cultural change will not happen without the involvement of government, industry, and science, and will also not happen without a fight. He points out that our current ways of communication, mostly online, makes this difficult. He says, in the real world, we can practice moderation, emotional flexitarianism. Online, where most of the vegan war's most intense skirmishes are currently being fought, we do not find compromise or even look for it. The internet has made communication highly charged and polarized. The only way to be heard in such a screaming vortex is to shout louder. Even so, he concedes that the body of evidence is growing too large to ignore, with an increasing number of reports pointing to animal agriculture as one of the leading causes of environmental destruction. The QC, Michael Mansfield, I didn't know what QC meant. It's a British thing, it stands for Queen's Counsel, but basically a really high up lawyer, gave a speech at a vegan event where he suggested that meat eating could become illegal. In the same speech, he coined the term ecocide, classifying meat eating as a crime against humanity. The author suggests that red meat could become the new tobacco, a vice coming with heavy warning labels and enjoyed by a select few. He ends the article with this quote, which is just brilliant. We might portray the current moment as a precipice and the growing interest in plant-based diets as the surest way back to safety. In this interpretation, the war on vegans is the act of a doomed majority fighting to defend its harmful way of life. Vegans might well be vociferous and annoying, holier-than-thou, self-satisfied, and evangelical. But as their numbers grow beyond the margins, perhaps the worst thing they could be is right. I really felt that quote. I, like I'm sure many of you that are vegan, wasn't vegan for a long time before I was vegan, and I had thoughts about veganism, like most people do. And I always felt that internally, when I would feel that internal conflict, when someone would say something that would annoy me, when I would get triggered by thinking someone was being preachy or something like that, there was always this small voice in my head that was like, you're so annoyed at them because you know they're right. I knew I was gonna do it and I knew I had to do it, but I was annoyed. I was like, God, why do I have to, oh God, why do I have to do this? But I knew that it was the right thing to do. And that's what I think was so annoying the whole time. You know, it's like, we're not even annoyed at vegans. I think we're just annoyed that the world is the way it is. Why do I have to give up this thing that I love eating just because like some asshole decided to invent this cruel way of acquiring food centuries ago? Now I have to make a change. It's hard to accept. And if it were up to me why people hate vegans, I would say that is kind of the heart of it. On this whole topic, I'm less concerned about each individual person and their opinions. Like when someone's like, vegans suck, I'm just like, oh, you're misinformed, that's sad. I'm more concerned with how that sentiment got woven into the fabric of society and how best to unspool it. I don't know if it's possible to be someone that's like, you know, I support vegans, I respect what you're doing, but then have no inclination toward it at all. I almost feel like, as much as I sometimes believe that going vegan, there's this whole spectrum, I almost feel like there is a very black and white moment. It's almost like the moment you stop hating vegans, the more vegan you start to become. And I think at the end of the day, like the author said, that hatred is based really in that fear. I hope you found this article as fascinating as I did. I learned so much reading it. I will now, anytime I'm mad at Paul, refer to him as sour-visaged. I think conversations like this are really important in terms of progressing the vegan movement forward. So thank you for being a part of that, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.